Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today I'm going over the 2026 US Senate elections. In this video, I'm going to be doing a best case scenario for the Republicans in 2026. Just a few days ago, I did a best case scenario for the Democrats. So for today's video, I am now doing one for the Republicans. Now this comes as the polling data for the Republicans is not looking too great for 2026, as President Trump's approval rating is currently sitting at a record low for his second term at minus 12.7. And the congressional ballot is also sitting at a record low for the Republicans at Democrat plus 4.8. But for today's video, we're going to just reverse the course here and go through what I think is a best case scenario for the Republicans. Starting first with all the states I expect to be more than a 15-point victory in the GOP's best case. These are going to be wins in the states of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and South Carolina, all 100% being safe for the GOP, with a few states right around that 15-point line that I'm also narrowly going to add into the 15-point column, one of these being the state of Florida. Now it's possible you can make an argument for Texas and Alaska being safe in the GOP's best case scenario, but even then I don't think we're ultimately going to see that end up happening. So those are all the safe states for the GOP, putting them up at 46 Senate seats, so already a very strong gain for the GOP to start off. However, there are a handful of seats that I expect to be safe, more than 15 points for the Democrats. Now these are not really any surprises. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey with Cory Booker, especially after the 2025 elections, even in the Republicans' best case, I don't think is going to be in play, especially not at the Senate level. Will be safe for the Democrats. Delaware, I expect, will be safe. Virginia, it's possible Virginia starts as likely Democratic, but then again, looking at it, I think we're probably going to see Virginia be safe Democratic. Illinois will be safe, as well as Oregon and Colorado. This puts the Democrats at 42, Republicans at 46. Now, the next states that I have are likely. These are going to be states in between 5 and 15 percentage points. Now, first things first, I'm actually going to start with the states for the Democrats because there's actually more on the Republican side, and I want to delve a little bit more into them. The first one for the Democrats is New Mexico, which I believe is going to be Ben Ray Lujan, the Democratic senator. The Republicans could try and contest New Mexico, but it's also kind of like a state like Virginia, like New Jersey, where I don't think it's going to be too competitive for the Senate elections in 2026. Maybe in 2028 or 2032, the Republicans may try and make it more competitive, but I don't think at the Senate level is going to be too competitive in 26 in New Mexico. I would also put Minnesota in this category as well, as this is going to be an open race. Peggy Flanagan, Angie Craig running on the Democratic side. The Republicans just don't really have a strong candidate. Royce White, the nominee from 2024, who lost by more than 15 points, is currently the Republicans' best chance in this race. So I don't think the Republicans have too much of a chance at winning there. But again, this is really not too much of a surprise on the map. The good news for the Republicans is in their best case scenario, these are the only two states I would put into the likely Democratic category. Now we have some states that I would put as likely for the GOP. First things first is Alaska. Alaska, Dan Sullivan, he could be facing off against potential Democrats, the most notable being Mary Peltola, the former Democratic representative. Now, even though it is a Republican best case scenario, I would have to say Peltola versus Sullivan, the Republicans' worst mistake would be underestimating her and her potentially pulling off an upset like she did in 2022 against Nick Begich and Sarah Palin. However, Nick Begich did defeat Peltola in 2024, and Dan Sullivan, as the incumbent U.S. Senator, I think has a stronger chance of winning this race than Nick Begich did as the challenger, making it an over 5-point win. But in the Republicans' best case scenario, I think Alaska would be a likely GOP win when everything was said and done. The next likely state I would put in there is the state of Texas with John Cornyn. Now, the polling data early on thus far has shown a very tight race, especially if Ken Paxton's able to defeat John Cornyn in the Republican primary. If John Cornyn becomes the Republican candidate, most polls have shown him winning by more than 5 points in a lot of aspects. So Cornyn winning probably gives the Republicans the best chance at the general election level if he can pull off the GOP primary. If it's Ken Paxton or Wesley Hunt, the polling differs depending on which candidate it is. It also shows Paxton is the least successful GOP candidate in the polling, but even then, odds are that in the best GOP case scenario, Paxton would still win this race. The question would be, what the margins would be. But overall, Texas would still be likely for the GOP if Cornyn wins there. Next, we're going to move to Nebraska, where a state that's not usually competitive is going to be Republican Pete Ricketts facing off against independent Dan Osborne. Now, Osborne made it roughly a 7-point race against Deb Fischer in 2024, which is going to put Republicans certainly on edge for the Senate race in 2026. Now, in a state like Nebraska that voted for Donald Trump by roughly 20 points, the Republicans, with their Republican incumbent who has seen what Dan Osborne can do against his fellow Republican incumbent, would probably not take him as lightly and take him as a serious candidate, which would put in the Republican best case scenario still under 15 points, but one the Republicans should handily win by around 10 points or so, assuming they don't take Dan Osborne lightly. This puts the Republicans up at 49, Democrats are at 44. Now, the Republicans, I expect, will hold the Senate with two key states. First being Iowa. This is currently held by Republican Senator Joni Ernst, who before announcing her retirement did have a few very big scandals come out against her in regards to her comments on healthcare, and another one showing her polling data really being potentially in jeopardy of a Democratic challenge. With Ernst not running and U.S. Representative Ashley Hinson running and having the endorsement of President Trump already in this race, not only does that seal up the Republican primary, but in a state like Iowa, which has voted for Donald Trump by roughly around 8 points or more, in 2024, 2020, and 2016, Iowa should be in the likely Republican category for 2026, and the Republicans hopefully should have staved off really being scared about losing that seat. So this gets the Republicans to 50 Senate seats, and with Vice President Vance breaking the tie, guarantees the Republicans another 2-year term as the Senate majority in the U.S. Senate. However, I think their numbers could potentially grow from there. The next is going to be the state of Ohio, where Republican John Husted will be facing off against former Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown. Now, Sherrod Brown only lost as the Democratic incumbent in 2024 by a little bit under 4 points, which is going to make him a very formidable candidate, also being a former Democratic senator. Now, that being said, in all respective terms, John Husted, as the incumbent Republican, is a stronger candidate than Bernie Moreno was as the Republican challenger. Husted also probably won't have as hard of a time alienating some independent voters as maybe Bernie Moreno did. So I think we're going to see John Husted win against Sherrod Brown in this scenario, and breaking with some of my past predictions, I think we see Ohio go by more than 5 points. Now, this is a Republican best case scenario if this happens. Not in the best case scenario in real life, I think it's more competitive and it's under 5 points, but in the best case scenario, I think Husted should be able to defeat Brown by more than 5 points, especially as Ohio, like Iowa, has been one of the most Republican trending states under President Trump, along with Ohio, Iowa, and Florida, and you could argue Texas after the 2024 election. So Republicans up to 51, Democrats 44. Now this is where the electoral or the Senate map really starts to shift and make a move here. The first of these 5 remaining seats in Maine, New Hampshire, Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia starts with the state of Maine, where the Republicans, to have their best case scenario in the Senate, need to hold what they already have. And Susan Collins, the Republican senator from Maine, is a very special case. She is the only Republican senator from a state that Kamala Harris won in 2024. Now, Susan Collins is going to be in for a very tough fight in 2026, likely facing off against either the governor, Janet Mills, or Democrat candidate, Graham Plattner. Now, all polling that's come out thus far suggests Collins has a better chance at winning against Plattner in the general election than Janet Mills, due to several of Plattner's scandals. So in the Republicans' best case scenario, Plattner becomes a Democratic nominee. More independents that voted for Collins in 2020 come back again and vote for her, and that leads to Collins winning this race by around a lean to likely margin. Right around 5 points or so once ranked choice voting takes effect, which I do still think will ultimately happen. But Susan Collins winning this race against Graham Plattner certainly is on the table there. This puts Republicans at 52. The next most important state is North Carolina, which is Tom Tillis' seat, which is now open. It's going to be a very competitive race between Michael Whatley and Roy Cooper, one where most election predictions thus far I've seen have Michael Whatley actually losing to Roy Cooper right now. In the Republicans' best case scenario, though, North Carolina, which has been a consistent lean Republican state across the last few presidential and Senate elections, would continue that trend and vote for Michael Whatley over Roy Cooper in a lean Republican category. Now, this would be very big in the Republicans' best case scenario, holding Maine and North Carolina, especially in North Carolina, as Cooper is currently leading in the early polling. The momentum's on the Democrats' side. It would be big for the Republicans to hold it there. Now, that's not where the Senate map ends, though. At 53, this is where the Republicans currently stand. There are 3 Senate seats outstanding the Republicans are hoping to try and pick up. First is technically the state of Michigan. Michigan, I would say, is slightly above Georgia due to the fact that it is an open seat. And the Republicans do have a big advantage in Michigan in one respective category, which is the Democratic primary is extremely competitive right now. Between Mallory McMorrow, Haley Stevens, and Abdul Al-Sayed, there's going to be a lot of Democratic voters splitting their vote in the Democratic primary, where a few handful of hundreds of votes will pick the Democratic nominee, which could lead to a fractured party in the general election in November. Now, Democrats do have a strong history of coalescing around their nominees and will make it a very close race regardless. But Mike Rogers, having a unified GOP behind him, including the endorsement of President Trump, will give him a very strong fighting chance in this race. And in a race where he lost to Democrat Elisa Slotkin by under 1 point in 2024, we could see Mike Rogers get lucky and narrowly win this race by under 1 point in 2026, essentially completing a similar arc to what Dave McCormick did in Pennsylvania in 2022 and then winning in 2024. This time we see Mike Rogers maybe being able to pull off the upset. Now, I do think for this to happen, we may see a little bit of third-party split voting here to help Mike Rogers out, as without President Trump at the top of the ticket, it's going to be hard to get voter turnout. But I do think Michigan, in the right scenario for Mike Rogers, could potentially flip to the GOP. Georgia, I think, is going to be a little bit trickier than Michigan, but still is very much possible. And in Georgia, this is Democrat Jon Ossoff, and the Republicans do not have one clear candidate running. Brian Kemp, if he did run, probably could have won against Jon Ossoff in just a regular scenario, not even the GOP best case scenario. Mike Collins, Derek Dooley, and Buddy Carter are the main Republicans running right now. The early polling shows Mike Collins as the strongest Republican candidate against Jon Ossoff, even though in most polls he is losing by 1 to 2 points. In the Republicans' best case scenario, though, we could see this race ultimately go to a runoff election where there's enough election day momentum, Jon Ossoff falls off a little bit, and Mike Collins is able to nearly pull off the upset by under 1 point. Georgia, the Democrats certainly have the advantage right now heading into the midterms, and there's not much room for error for the GOP to win that race in Georgia in 2026, but it is possible if everything were to go the GOP's way. The last race that is certainly a wild card for 2026 is the state of New Hampshire, where Democrat U.S. Senator Jeanne Shaheen is retiring, and U.S. Representative of the 1st District, Chris Pappas, is the likely Democratic nominee. And it looked like, for a while, this race could potentially be competitive, with former Governor Chris Sununu considering a run, and former U.S. Senator Scott Brown also considering a run. Now, Chris Sununu ultimately decided he would not run, but Scott Brown did enter this race and looked to be making the race competitive, until early polling came out showing Scott Brown being down by Chris Pappas by over 10 points in multiple polls, showing that what looked like could be a competitive race, at least on paper, was not really shaping up to be that way. But then, a blast from the past for New Hampshire politics, Chris Sununu's older brother, John E. Sununu, announced that he was interested in running for this race, trying to get his old job back, which he lost to Jeanne Shaheen in 2008, even though he did lose to Shaheen by a smaller margin than John McCain lost to Barack Obama by in the Granite State. So now Shaheen not running, and John Sununu, the former U.S. Senator, running in this race. Sununu, obviously very popular political name in the state of New Hampshire, gives the Republicans a rare opportunity at winning this state. I think the best Republicans to run for U.S. Senate that could win in New Hampshire are Chris Sununu, Kelly Ayotte, and John E. Sununu, probably in that order, as Ayotte now has the advantage not only of being a moderate Republican, but also being the governor of the state. But Sununu also carries that family name. John Sununu carries that family name, and he also carries being more of a moderate Republican, which for a lot of other Republican states may not play as well in the Trump era, but in the state of New Hampshire certainly could play to the Republicans' advantage. So John E. Sununu versus Chris Pappas is going to be very, very close, and we're going to see something that, if the Republicans pull it off, probably similar to what we saw, best I would say similar to 2016, where Hillary Clinton defeated Donald Trump by 0.37%, but with a few votes flipping here and there, with John Sununu making marginal gains in Hillsborough County, winning it by around a point to a point and a half, and Merrimack County probably barely going, just barely for Chris Pappas, would be just enough to narrowly put the state in the Republican category in New Hampshire, with the first time the Republicans, get this, the first time the Republicans would win a Senate seat in New Hampshire since Kelly Ayotte won in the midterm year of 2010. Would be the first time New Hampshire goes red at the Senate level. So if that were to happen, the Republicans in their best case scenario for 2026, bucking all polling trends for President Trump and the Republicans versus Democrats nationally at the congressional ballot level, would get the Republicans up to 56, Democrats at 44, and would set the Republicans up for a very large majority heading into 2028. In a Senate map, where there are certainly a handful of pickup opportunities for the Democrats in states like Wisconsin and North Carolina, but also giving the Republicans some pickup opportunities in Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. So there's 2 pickup opportunities realistically for the Democrats, but 4 for the Republicans in these states, and maybe potentially in New Hampshire if Maggie Hassan runs potentially maybe against a rematch of Governor Kelly Ayotte. If former Governor Sununu decides to make a run, maybe both Sununus could represent the U.S. Senate. Maybe Scott Brown decides to run for that one. Maybe he does a better job at polling in that one. Maybe he could make New Hampshire competitive as well. So if the Republicans could win 56 Senate seats in 2026, it gives them a much stronger chance going forward into 2028 and keeping the Senate red for a very long time. Now, obviously, this is the Republicans' best case scenario for 2026. This is not what I'm expecting to happen in 2026, probably far from what I'm expecting to happen, but I thought this would be an interesting video to go over, and if everything went the GOP's way, this is how I think it could break down. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, make sure to check out my prior videos I did on the Democrats' best case scenario for House, Senate, and Governor. That should now be up on the page. If you're also interested in seeing more Republican wins, I just did a video for a Republican's best case scenario for the U.S. House map, and tomorrow I'll be having a video drop on the Governor map best case scenario for the Republicans. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to hit like and subscribe, and again, check out those videos, and I hope to see you in a future video.